welcome to the deep dive.
Good to be here.
So today, we're tackling a really big one, aren't we? Equality.
Yeah, it sounds straightforward maybe, but gosh, it gets complicated fast.
Absolutely. It's fundamental to how societies are set up, but yeah, sparks so much debate. We're diving into this really rich conversation between Thomas Piketty and Michael Sandel.
Right. Two major thinkers really digging into equality in, well, all its different shapes and forms.
Exactly. You start looking and realize it's got so many layers. Economic, political, social.
And it impacts pretty much everything, doesn't it?
It does. So our mission here in this deep dive is really to cut through some of that noise.
Yeah, unpack what they're saying, why they see inequality as such a critical issue right now.
Look at the history a bit, how we got here, and explore some of the paths forward they talk about. Some pretty radical ideas in there, actually.
Definitely food for thought.
Ultimately, we want to get to the heart of what equality means and, why it matters to you, the listener. Find the most important takeaways.
Okay, so where do we start? That basic question.
Let's do it. Why worry about inequality? Why does it matter?
And Piketty's work, well, it hits you immediately with those numbers, doesn't it?
Yeah, really stark. You look at Europe, the richest 10%, they're taking home, over a third of all income?
And owning more than half of all property, it's staggering.
And then you look across the pond, the United States.
Yeah.
Even more extreme.
Much more. And I think for a lot of us, you see those figures and it just feels wrong,
Right, it's a gut feeling. But these guys push us to understand why.
Yeah.
Why it fundamentally matters beyond that feeling.
And Piketty has this really interesting long-term view, puts the current situation in historical context.
Which is surprising because looking at those numbers, you wouldn't necessarily expect optimism.
Exactly. It feels counterintuitive. But he argues that despite today's levels, the long historical trend has actually been towards greater equality.
Okay, so where does that come from? What's driven that historically?
It comes down to these massive forces, really. Huge social movements, political demand for equal rights, for access to fundamental things.
Like education, healthcare.
Right, the vote, being able to participate in society with dignity. These things weren't just handed over. They were fought for.
You think about the big shifts.
Yeah.
The French Revolution, American Revolution, abolishing slavery.
Labor movements, suffrage, Social Security, progressive taxes, decolonization. Huge transformative struggles.
Yeah.
And Piketty makes the point that even in this, neoliberal era since the 80s, where we've seen income and wealth inequalities shoot up again in some ways,
Right.
there's still been progress in other areas, like gender equality, racial equality, even some narrowing between the global north and south.
So the underlying driver, they argue, is this kind of constant human push for democracy, for dignity.
That seems to be the core idea. It's not just about the money, though. That's huge. It's rights, access, participation, dignity.
Okay, but let's try Sandel's thought experiment. He asks, imagine, just hypothetically,
Right.
imagine we somehow guaranteed political equality. No big money in politics, totally fair access. And everyone had equal access to basic goods, good schools, good healthcare.
Okay. A hypothetical ideal world in some ways.
But you still have the massive income and wealth gaps we see today. Would that still be a problem?
And their answer is a very clear yes, a profound yes.
Why? If you have the political voice and the basic goods.
Because, as Piketty argues, that sheer monetary distance, it inevitably creates social distance. It changes human relationships, creates power imbalances, even just, in your local community.
That example he uses is so vivid, where one person's hour of earnings lets them buy someone else's entire year of work.
Exactly. That's not just about buying more stuff. That's a fundamental difference in power and how people relate to each other. It creates a hierarchy that they see as really corrosive to dignity and genuine democratic life.
It changes the whole feel of society.
And Piketty also connects reducing inequality historically, especially through things like universal education to economic prosperity.
Right. It wasn't a drag on growth. It was essential for it.
Absolutely. It wasn't a trade-off.
Yeah.
But what counts as a basic good changes over time, right?
That's a key point. Universal high school was the battleground once.
Now it's access to good quality higher education. And they argue that kind of giving up on ambitious goals there is a big part of our current problems.
But then they bring in this international angle, the north-south dimension, which really complicates the nice story of progress.
Yeah, this is critical. They force us to confront the fact that a lot of the wealth and progress in the global north was historically built on, well, exploitation.
Resources, labor from the South,
Yeah.
often brutally extracted.
Exactly. And then you add the environmental cost, the threat to the whole planet. It really challenges that simple narrative of internal progress within nations.
So addressing that legacy, the North-South gap, the climate crisis, that requires pushing for equality on a whole new level.
A much bigger, more global scale than before.
Okay, so this takes us beyond just economics and politics into that third dimension, social relations, dignity. And this is where they start talking about solutions that go beyond just, say, tinkering with taxes a bit.
Right. Piketty starts talking about this idea of gradual decommodification.
Decommodification, that sounds different. It's not just redistribution, is it?
No, it's distinct. Sandel sets it up nicely with another thought experiment. Imagine two futures. One, radical redistribution. Everyone has the same money, but everything vital, healthcare, education, maybe even housing, is still bought and sold on the market.
Okay, equal buying power, but market logic rules.
Versus option two, radical decommodification. Money matters much less for the basics. Maybe income inequality persists, but healthcare, education, etc. are largely outside the market system, which is better.
Interesting contrast. What's their take?
Piketty jumps in and argues that what we now call social democracy, in places like Sweden, post-war UK, was radical decommodification in its day.
How so?
They used really progressive taxes, not just to redistribute cash, but to fund universal public services, taking huge chunks of the economy, education, health largely out of the pure profit motive, shifting away from wealth determining access.
And those sectors are massive, right?
Yeah.
Education and health alone.
Easily 25% of the economy in developed countries, yeah. And they argue where it's been done seriously, like European healthcare versus the U.S.
It works better.
Significantly better outcomes in Europe, despite the U.S. spending vastly more money. The market approach hasn't delivered in the same way.
And Piketty stresses that this decommodification didn't happen in isolation, did it? It worked with redistribution.
Exactly. It went hand in hand with things like high progressive taxes, strong minimum wages, powerful trade unions. He points back to U.S. history again.
Those high top tax rates, 80, 90%.
From the 1930s right up to the 1980s. And that period saw huge economic growth and productivity gains. It wasn't a growth killer.
So the idea is push decommodification far enough if almost everything essential is free or publicly provided.
Then maybe pure monetary inequality becomes less damaging, less relevant to people's lives and dignity. But we're nowhere near that point.
So you need both, decommodification and redistribution.
That's the argument. History shows they work best together.
And they link the decline of this model to a breakdown in trust, right? The social contract fraying.
Yeah, this feeling, maybe among the middle class, that the wealthy aren't paying their fair share anymore, that erodes the willingness to fund public services for everyone.
Which undermines the whole system.
Absolutely. And they see progressive taxation not just as revenue raising, but as regulating power, making sure talent goes into public service, not just chasing the biggest paycheck. It worked before.
Okay, but then Sandel adds another layer to this decommodification argument. It's not just about access.
Right. This is his corruption argument. It's deeper. Does the very act of putting something up for sale, treating it like a commodity, actually damage or corrupt the good itself?
Regardless of whether everyone can afford it.
Exactly. He uses higher education again. If you treat it mainly as a path to a high-paying job, does that crowd out the intrinsic values? Learning for its own sake, critical thinking, becoming a good citizen.
Does the market logic change what education is?
That's the question. And Piketty jumps right on board with this strongly. He sees commodification as corrupting teaching, teaching to the test, killing curiosity. He brings up the U.S. health system. Again, more market focus hasn't meant better health.
And they look at history, too. Adam Smith worried about tutors paid by student numbers.
Right. Might incentivize quantity over quality. Piketty points to disasters like Trump University, but also notes that the most successful elite universities, like Harvard, are nonprofits. Why? Because they know the profit motive could undermine their core mission.
And a really key insight here is about how we even value public services.
Yeah, this is crucial. How do we decide what public healthcare or education is worth in our national accounts? It's not a pure market calculation.
It's political, right? A social judgment.
Exactly. Deciding teacher salaries, doctor salaries in a public system that's political deliberation. It's judgmental evaluation, as they put it. And they think we need more of that, not less, especially if we decommodify further.
But they also warn that just expanding access, like to universities, without expanding resources.
Just creates inequality within the system. Elite private versus strained public. You need the resources, which means revisiting taxation and redistribution.
Piketty also throws in ideas about democratizing companies themselves, like worker representation on boards.
Yeah, giving workers, say, 50% of voting rights, or capping the power of huge individual shareholders,
Yeah.
spreading the power within the economy itself.
But always coming back to that international limit. 20th century social democracy was national.
And it didn't fully grapple with the global inequalities, the reliance on resources and labor from the South. That's the big challenge now.
Which leads us straight into globalization, particularly the post-1980s hyper-globalization.
Right, the era of really free-flowing capital and trade. And they highlight this interesting tension, the left-right split.
Yeah. Often the left critiques free capital and trade, but supports free movement of people, immigration.
Yeah.
The right often wants free capital and trade, but wants to restrict immigration. Who's being inconsistent there?
Sandel connects this back to his earlier work, Democracy's Discontent.
Arguing that center-left governments, Clinton, Obama, their European counterparts, embraced free trade, financialization, the whole meritocracy idea.
And in doing so, kind of weakened democratic control and opened the door for the right.
Exactly. Allowed figures like Trump to position themselves as champions of those left behind by globalization.
Piketty seems to agree the center-left needs some self-reflection there.
Definitely. He points out that Clinton and Obama continued weakening progressive taxes, pursued NAFTA, China, and the WTO, policies that accelerated globalization's downsides for many.
And their main point seems to be, you have to control something.
Right. If you let capital and trade run completely free without social or environmental checks,
then the political pressure inevitably shifts to the thing you can seem to control, which is borders, labor flows. Precisely. Which leads directly to the nativist anti-immigrant backlash, Trump, Brexit, Le Pen.
so instead of walls, they argue we should be controlling capital and trade more effectively.
That's the core argument. Piketty contrasts that nationalist nativist response with what he calls a democratic socialist one, like Sanders.
Although Sandel uses populism for both, right? Piketty pushes back on that term.
Yeah, Piketty worries populism gets used by elites to dismiss any challenge, lumping together very different things. He prefers clearer labels: nationalist, socialist, liberal.
Sandel defends populism in the U.S. context, though people versus elites, sometimes with nativism mixed in. He sees Trumpism as partly a reaction to failures like the Wall Street bailout.
Right, the feeling that elites were saved while ordinary people suffered, that fueled anger on both left Occupy Sanders and right Tea Party Trump.
But they both seem to agree the center-left bought into market triumphalism.
Yeah, this idea that markets are the best way to solve problems, to find the public good. Accepting that premise led to deregulation, unchecked globalization.
And Sandel has a hunch why that was so appealing.
But in diverse societies, markets seem neutral, a way to avoid messy arguments about values.
Avoiding the difficult democratic debates.
Piketty calls it a fear of democracy, a fear of opening Pandora's box about redistribution, about what we truly value. He sees figures like Sanders and Warren as actually having that debate, which he thinks is necessary.
Okay, let's shift to another huge theme, meritocracy. Sandel's book, The Tyranny of Merit.
Right, and he identifies two big problems with it. First, the obvious one. We don't actually live up to it.
Opportunities just aren't equal. That Ivy League statistic is just jaw-dropping.
More students from the top 1% than the entire bottom 50%.
Yeah.
And things like legacy admissions, donor preferences, they just make a mockery of equal opportunity.
But Sandel's second point is maybe even more profound, even if it were perfect.
Even if we had perfect equality of opportunity, he argues meritocracy itself corrodes the common good. It breeds hubris in the winners, I did it all myself, forgetting luck, background, societal help. And it inflicts humiliation on the losers. It's my own fault, leading to shame and resentment.
Which connects directly to the polarization we see. That advice, just get a degree.
Can feel like a real slap in the face if you're struggling without one, especially coming from elites or parties seen as representing the credentialed. It fuels anger.
Piketty agrees this modern inequality ideology is uniquely harsh, right?
Yeah.
Celebrating winners, blaming losers.
Yeah, he contrasts it with older systems that maybe had rigid hierarchies, but perhaps less psychological burden, maybe even a sense of different groups having complementary roles, however unequal. This system seems particularly brutal psychologically.
So what do they suggest, especially for higher education if it's such a key part of this meritocratic sorting? Piketty asks about forcing universities to change.
Like banning legacy and donor preferences, Sandel thinks they should go. He talks about public pressure and moral argument, notes the Supreme Court ruling on race might make legacy harder to defend legally.
But Piketty wants more direct action. Government stepping in.
Yeah, he argues society shouldn't tolerate these exceptions for the wealthy. Same rules for everyone. Maybe even favoring low-income applicants, but definitely not giving rich kids a leg up. He brings up Imperial China again. Even they had ways for the rich to buy access. It's an old problem we can choose to fight.
And then Sandel throws out the lottery idea for elite universities.
Right. Among qualified applicants, use a lottery.
Not necessarily to change the class mix overnight, though it might help.
His main goal is deeper. Change the meaning of getting in. Remind everyone winners and losers about the role of luck.
Reduce the hubris, reduce the humiliation.
Exactly. Take some of the intense pressure and sorting machine feeling out of it.
And he extends this idea to government. A lottery for a parliamentary chamber.
Yeah, like the ancient Greeks did, or like juries today. Randomly select citizens for a second chamber.
What would be the point of that?
Reduce money's influence, bring in different perspectives, challenge the idea that only people with certain credentials should govern. He points out the massive underrepresentation of people without degrees in legislatures everywhere.
Compared to progress on gender representation, for instance.
Right. Piketty wonders if other methods might work better, or alongside lotteries. He mentions Julia Cage's idea.
Requiring parties to field diverse candidates. Proportionally.
Yeah, based on income, education, etc., with financial penalties if their elected officials don't reflect the population. India does something like this with reserved seats.
So that combines representation with elections, accountability.
Right. Sandel seems open to different approaches. The key is having the debate about who governs and how we get more representative bodies. Lotteries are one way to spark that.
But it comes back to that sorting machine aspect of universities, that feeling of being judged and found wanting. How do we escape that?
And Piketty brings it back to basics. Dignity. He proposes really compressing the income scale.
Dramatically. Like the top earners making only 5 or 10 times the bottom earners, not 50 or 100 times.
Exactly. He argues those huge gaps are intrinsically bad for dignity, for social relations. When some people can just buy vast amounts of others' time, it warps things.
So bring back maximum wages, super high top tax rates again.
Yeah, he points to the U.S. historical success with 80, 90% rates, and then he challenges Sandel, challenges philosophers generally.
To get involved in this fight, not just theorize about justice.
Right. He contrasts Rawls, who he sees as a bit detached on tax history, with Hayek and Nozick, who actively fought against progressive taxes. He asks, shouldn't philosophers fight for income compression if it's about dignity?
How does Sandel respond to that?
He says, sure, you can justify progressive tax using Rawls, especially the difference principle helping the least well off. But his main issue with Rawls is trying to separate justice from ideas about the good life from what we value collectively.
Sandel thinks you need something more for progressive taxes.
Yeah, a strong sense of community, solidarity, mutual responsibility, recognizing we're all indebted to society. Traditional socialism understood this. He feels Rawls shied away from it.
But how do you build that solidarity in a diverse society?
Piketty stresses wealth is collective. Sandel suggests concrete things, investing in class-mixing institutions.
Like public schools, parks, libraries.
Exactly. Places where rich and poor actually encounter each other, share spaces, build common experiences. That builds the habits of solidarity needed to support progressive policies politically.
So it's reciprocal. Policy needs solidarity. Solidarity needs shared spaces and experiences.
They seem to think you need to work on both at once.
Which brings us back to that toughest question. What about beyond the nation state? Transnational equality.
Yeah, can you build that kind of solidarity across borders? Piketty's long-term vision is ambitious, democratic, federal, international socialism, global taxes. Maybe a United States of the world, eventually.
Wow. It's a long way off.
What about now?
You know,
He insists unilateral action is also vital. Countries shouldn't wait. He slams the current system where the rich can just move money international to avoid taxes, governments claiming they're helpless. He calls that hypocritical internationalism that makes people hate the idea.
and he links this failure on capital control directly to populism again.
Absolutely. Those job losses from NAFTA, China joining the WTO, he cites studies showing that's where Trump and Le Pen got huge votes, more so than in areas with high immigration.
So the left lost ground by not addressing trade and jobs adequately.
That's his argument.
Hmm.
And trying to compete on identity politics won't work. You have to tackle the economic structure.
So what's the unilateral action, he suggests?
Countries setting conditions on trade, like imposing a tax difference on imports from places with much lower corporate taxes or weaker climate rules.
A kind of universalist sovereignism, using national power to push for higher global standards.
Exactly. Not pure protectionism, but creating incentives for others to level up. Maybe even sending some revenue to the global south. Avoids waiting for everyone to agree, which never happens.
The alternative being.
Nativists just focusing on controlling borders, blaming migrants, which gets ugly, and maybe progressives ending up defending the winners of globalization.
What about climate change? Same problem of getting agreement.
Huge problem. Piketty is very skeptical of carbon trading schemes, sees them as letting the rich North off the hook for actually cutting emissions.
And he emphasizes the historical imbalance, right? The North's huge contribution versus the South's vulnerability.
Yeah, huge future backlash potential there. His solution: shift from country-to-country aid to a global class conflict approach.
Yeah.
Target global billionaires and multinationals with a global tax. Send a chunk of that directly to the global south based on population, climate risk for green investment, schools, hospitals.
Linking climate action to development and historical justice.
He sees it as necessary for any real north-south reconciliation.
And open borders, how does that fit in?
He connects free movement to funding. Look at the EU free student movement, but no common university funding, so you get restrictions, fees. True free movement globally needs global public funding via international taxes.
In the current situation, like in the Mediterranean.
He calls it unacceptable. We could do much better. He argues the focus on blaming migrants comes precisely because the ambitious egalitarian agenda taxing the rich, funding public goods, was abandoned.
Okay, so final theme. The future of the left. Economics versus identity. Sandel thinks the left let the right capture patriotism, community.
Yeah, he argues the left needs its own version, maybe economic patriotism, demanding companies pay taxes, needs that sense of belonging to sustain the welfare state. Has the left lost that solidarity focus?
But Piketty keeps coming back to economics driving the votes. Job losses, trade impact.
Right. He insists the data shows that's the main driver for Trump Le Pen voters, not just immigration fears. He points to Le Pen's voters shifting away from diverse urban areas towards deindustrialized towns.
And he mentions stigma, too. People in those areas feeling looked down upon by elites.
Yes, blamed for climate change because they drive cars or live in houses. That's a real grievance, tied to identity in a way, but rooted in economic change and social status.
And he blames the left, partly, for championing globalization without questioning its structure enough.
Yeah, and getting trapped, waiting for international agreements, leaving only border control as the policy lever. He brings back his three ideologies: liberalism, markets; nationalism, identity, often avail; socialism, internationalist, redistributive. Argues the socialist pillar needs rebuilding.
Sandel sees less of a sharp line between economics and identity, though. Job loss is an identity issue.
Right. It affects your sense of self-worth, of being valued. That feeling of being looked down upon is incredibly powerful politically.
Piketty concedes that point about stigma and recognition. It's not ethnic identity, but it's real.
And they both look at the voting shifts: rich areas going Democrat, poorer areas Republican. Piketty argues Democrats might need to risk losing some elite votes to reconnect, not by being anti-immigrant, but by challenging the economic system and the stigma it creates.
Sandel's anecdote about Florida captures that feeling of coastal elites looking down.
We know how to read in Iowa.
Yeah, it's potent. And Sandel's final hunch is that this dignity status recognition dimension, that might be the key.
The most powerful force and the key to unlocking economic and political change.
That seems to be his feeling. Piketty finds it reasonable, sees the Sanders-Warren agenda, speaking to that, resonating with young people, offering a path beyond elite bases.
So as we wrap up, Sandel brings in Rousseau on the origin of inequality.
Famously points to enclosing property right. This land is mine.
But Rousseau adds something else. That the idea relied on prior competition for esteem, for recognition. That was the first step.
Piketty agrees both matter the property and the moral meaning we give to talent or success, which justifies the outcomes. But for Piketty, echoing Rousseau, the core problem isn't the first bit of property.
It's the unlimited accumulation. That's the issue.
Because accumulation equals power. Bargaining power over your life, over society.
Exactly. Some ownership gives choices. Boundless ownership concentrates power to a degree that fundamentally undermines equality.
So, agreement with Rousseau. Boundless private property accumulation is the problem.
Seems so.
Wow. We have covered an immense amount of ground today, really digging into what equality means, from the stark economic facts income, wealth to political power, and then this crucial social dimension.
Dignity, status, recognition. Yeah, it shows you really can't understand equality just through one lens. Economics, politics, philosophy, history, they all intersect. Piketty and Sandel really demonstrate that.
It's such a powerful reminder, isn't it, that building a more equal society isn't just about changing rules in some abstract way.
No, it's also deeply about culture, about cultivating respect, valuing everyone's contribution, regardless of what the market or credentials say right now.
Which leaves a big question for you, the listener, to think about after this deep dive.
Yeah, what can we actually do? In our own lives, communities, workplaces, conversations, how can we challenge those dynamics of disrespect, of stigma, that feeling of being looked down upon that they identify as so central to the whole problem?
Definitely something to ponder. We really hope this deep dive has given you some valuable insights and maybe sparked some new ways of thinking about this absolutely vital topic.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.